Hello, everyone. I would like to begin by saying thank you to the organization of the conference for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and at this important initiative, and also to be sharing my thoughts and my take on racism and indigenous people in Brazil with you. And also, I'm learning a lot. So thank you for that. I will begin by just showing exactly where I'm coming from. I'm from Brazil. I'm from the Tuxá people, which is an indigenous group located in north of Bahia, in the Atlantic coast of Brazil. I like to show the map because most people think that indigenous people in Brazil are only in Amazonia, but we are actually all across the country. In Brazil, we are more than 305 ethnic groups, indigenous groups, and we speak over 274 different languages. So I'm speaking from a place of very old colonization, because the colonization actually began in Bahia. It was the first state where Portuguese arrived in the 16th century. So it's an area by the San Francisco River. And well, that's it. Framing and naming violence. I would like to begin by saying that there was a very radical transformation in Brazil in the last decades, that was caused by the affirmative policies, mainly by the end of 2000, by the first decade of the 2000, government started to create affirmative policies for marginalized group to have access to universities. And in 2012, it was created the Quota Bill, which is a law that defined that 50% of all the places in public university were to be used by low-income students, Black students, and indigenous students. So I got in university in 2009. So I'm part of this first generation of indigenous students to go to university because of affirmative actions. And this is very different from other countries because in Brazil, we don't really have other indigenous, substantially speaking, that went to university before the affirmative policies. So we're speaking of very recent, the access of indigenous students to universities is very recent. In 2009, we had around 6,000 indigenous students, and in 2019, this number went to 60,000. So as you can see, affirmative policies to make sure that indigenous could go to university was very successful. And I think that in a certain sense, what we're doing now when we speak of racism is rewriting the history of colonization and rewriting the history of indigenous people in Brazil, because we are now being able to speak from that space which it produces knowledge, and that has been historically linked to oppression and marginalization. So the way that we are framing and naming violations of rights and violence in general through the grammar of racism is inseparable of the affirmative policies in the country. That's why I began by giving this context about affirmative actions. Because when we entered the university after 2010, it began to indigenous organizations and students began to make public letters saying about the situations they were experiencing in classrooms, in university, in relationships with professors. And we began to use more and more this word racism to speak about it. So this was very interesting because it was not a very often term used, although in some reports about violence, they could say some violence were caused because of racism. But it was mainly, in my research, I associate the rise of the usage of the term racism to university and to indigenous university students. Something that also happened in university was that we began to grow our connections with Black students groups in universities in universities. And when we share the experience, Black students will say, that is racism. What you're speaking of is racism. So we slowly begin to change the words that we use from prejudice, lack of information, and discrimination to label that as racism. But we had though so this talks about how we now frame and name violence as racism, but we could do a further research in trying to answer what happened and why was racism against indigenous people so invisible in the past. I mean, if you go in Google in Brazil and if you type racism, you will see and go to image, that's the image that you are going to see. And in a sense, there is this idea almost that Brazil is biracial. So you only see black and white in those pictures. You have to go like next page, next page, next page. Then you eventually see an indigenous with a headpiece or something like that. And then, so we do have something that we are trying to answer, which is what happened. It's clear for everyone here that studies racial discourse in the racial theories in the 19th century that indigenous people were racialized. But in somewhere in this history, the idea that indigenous were racialized in Brazil disappeared from hegemonic discourse. There are many ways that we can look to this invisibility and erasures. So the first idea is that we have this biracial country, and that speaks a lot about how the Brazilian colonial and after independence and republican produced a discourse that indigenous people were going to vanish. And through acculturation, through missionary practice, indigenous people were not supposed to exist in the present. So most of the discourse, racial discourse, didn't address indigenous because indigenous were a fading race. Which is not the case. As you can see in the census of 2010, we were almost 900,000 people, and in the last census in 2022, this number went to 1,600,000. So indigenous people are not we're not going anywhere. I mean, we're here and we're staying, and government is now trying to understand this number, how it went from almost it went double. It doubled in 10 years. Another factor that contributed to the erasure of the racial dimension of indigenous existence was the way that social science and in Brazil were the history of social science in Brazil, which is intimately linked with what we call nation building production. And we had in a dispute between what was sociology and what anthropology was, we had a division. So sociologists would answer the question of the black in Brazil. So a questão do negro was the subject of mostly for sociologists, and anthropologists was responsible to answer the question about a questão indígena. Né? So because when we think about nation building discourse, social scientists in Brazil were trying to answer the question, what it is to be Brazilian? What is this people that we call Brazilian? And obviously this mixed grammar, mixed discourse was the main one, but there was this separation. So sociologists would research the situation of black people, and anthropology the situation of indigenous. But anthropologists, after the Second World War, were particularly embarrassed by their participation in the racial theory elaboration. And so there was a refusal to use the term race. And in anthropology, race disappeared as part of the key concepts. And instead, we would only speak of cultural diversity and ethnicity. This is something that would partially explain, since indigenous discourses about indigenous were produced mainly within anthropology, and anthropologists wanted to forget about how the discipline was part of racial theories, how they would not frame indigenous people as racialized group. Also, racial democracy discourses, which was an idea that in Brazil, it was pointless to speak about race because everyone is a little bit of something. Everybody is one, the person is indigenous, is black, and that. So we had this Congress, we had this project in Brazil as we began to speak about racism and indigenous people, which was something that happened here in a collaboration with the University of Manchester. So they had the funding to study racism against indigenous people, and we had 3 seminars, and what we did was to gather leaderships, cacique, and chiefs from indigenous group to hear them, to how racism affected them, and how racism against indigenous people was different from racism against black people. This is also a project that we had that was very important, Tecendo Redes Antirracistas, which was an attempt to connect experiences in Africa, Portugal, Brazil, and it was mainly focused on black people, but they invited us because they thought they should connect to indigenous experience with racism as well. I just have 4 more slides that I would like to read for you about how we are framing this discussion. Although racial theories coined in the transition from the 18th to 19th centuries, which established differentiations and hierarchies among human groups based on a supposed relationship between physical characteristics and moral, cultural, and cognitive aptitudes, have already been strongly refuted and discredited, race as an idea continues to be very present in the collective imagination of Brazilian society. The fact is that racist attitudes toward the issues of difference were not invented or inaugurated by the creation of the scientific concept of race, nor did they cease to exist once their scientific bases were discredited. In other words, race as a classificatory scheme of differentiation between distinct people has a long history in the Western world that, contrary to what many believe, did not end with the evidence of the fallacious nature of racial theories. What several indigenous people have pointed out is that although we currently organize ourselves socially based on ethnicity, banishing concepts of race from indigenous discussions does not make racism disappear. Since we can point to elements of what came to be called race throughout colonization of America, it would be inconceivable to believe that the work of race would cease due to its discredit in the academic world as a genetic biological concept. And to finish, the place of phenotype, because I think someone already addressed the issue, and this is the core discussion that we do in Brazil, because when people think about race, they think about phenotype in first place. And we believe that indigenous racialization in Brazil happens regardless of phenotype. The existence of indigenous people was and continues to be a living reminder that the narrative of conquest and discovery were completely false, since these lands were not unoccupied. In colonial regimes and in the societies built on these territories, the grammar of race provided the necessary tools to establish the distinctions needed to deny possible recognition of indigenous existence and the rights coextensive with it, such as the original right to territories in which the colonizers settled. In this sense, the racialization of indigenous people seemed to be much more related to the nature of the bond between these people and colonial territories, land, as suggested by the categories itself, indigenous, autochthonous, and aboriginal, than to their physical characteristics, as in the case of the adjective black and its direct allusion to color and labor. If you go to the dictionary, if you see the etymology of indigenous, aboriginal, and autochthonous, what an indigenous is to decolonization is an obstacle to land. It doesn't reference phenotype. It doesn't reference skin color. It doesn't reference the way your hair look. It's about who you are to the colonial project. And this is what racialization of indigenous people bring into the table. The idea that as a racialization can happen regardless of phenotype, mainly because, I won't read this last one, but just to finish, we had many experience with indigenous people in Brazil, and as you can see in the map, we have indigenous people in very different situations when it comes to contact. We have isolated groups, we have groups that were contacted in the 16th century, and we have groups that were contacted 20, 30 years ago. And phenotype are very diverse when it comes to indigenous group. And if you speak to each and any of them, they will have a narrative about how their indigeneity was tried to be denied by someone. So the racialization of indigenous people in Brazil works in a way to deny acknowledgement that indigenous people exist in the present. So that's it. Thank you.